everybody, and welcome back to the Strength and Weakness podcast. I am Morgan, one of your co hosts here, along with Ellen, my other lovely co host, and we are excited you are joining us today. This was actually a topic that I have that I'm hoping Ellen can shed some light on for us. I currently have two kids now in elementary school, which is even crazy to say out loud. And what I am realizing is that we spend a lot of time talking about preteens and teens and how to navigate this conversation with them. Usually when it's like their own feelings, they're going through, pre-puberty or puberty, and they're, exploring who they are. One thing that we are coming across is in elementary school age, how to approach this topic with our kiddos before it hits them at school. And I wanted to bring the conversation to the podcast because I do think, again, like middle school and high school are not too far off for us. And I'm realizing, again, being a first-time parent of a second grader, is that second graders are just so curious about their bodies, about other people's bodies, about, things are funny to them now. We just got a school message yesterday that was talking about a fun game in the beginning of school turned into them kicking each other's butts and silly, innocent things like that. Like it still very much feels innocent, but I am realizing we are right around the corner from some of these bigger conversations. But the conversation today and the question today is how to approach the conversation of gender identity, parents of the same gender, kids in school who go by a female name or, a societal female name but yet dress and look like a boy. Like how do you reconcile that with your kindergartner when it might not make sense to them yet, but these are forming thought patterns for them? And how do we guide, our kiddos in this age? So Ellen, a very light, not complex question at all. We're really hoping that you could give us just a, quick one sentence and we'll wrap this podcast up. No, I'm just kidding. Would love your thoughts as we start to dive into the conversation.
Yeah, well, first I will say, I do write about this in my book, Love Covers Over, and I have a nice little, efficient way of saying it. But if you're still wanting more after this podcast, please go read that little blurb in my book because I do cover this more extensively, but also efficiently.
Ellen, we can put a little plug. We are going to be doing a little series where we read through Ellen's book and we do some chats about it afterwards. So stay tuned. We will definitely have a more extended version of this. But in the meantime, we'll give a little sneak peek behind the curtain.
Yeah. First, I would say, we, as much as we're able, want to be the first one to cover some of these topics with our kids. So I say that a little bit lightly because we're not always going to be able to meet that, and that's okay. We need to kind of approach this from a multi-pronged approach. We need to strive to be the first and have a plan to introduce these topics to our kids in a age-appropriate manner. But also we need to have kind of like a stop, drop, and roll plan for when we're not the first. When they come home and they said, Mom, what does this mean? Or what does that mean, right? We need to have a plan so that we don't react in fear. I would say that's probably the worst possible scenario is you react in fear and in so doing, bring tension and shame into that dynamic with your child over that topic. That usually produces a lot of tension and shame around the topic that you've discussed. And that's what we really want to avoid. So part of this, I would say, starts with your own heart before God. And I think that starts with you encountering the grief of raising children in a fallen world. They're going to encounter things that are not in our worldview as Christians, things that God does not say is best for us. Our kids are going to be affected by the brokenness of this world. They will be hurt by it. And if we live our lives as parents as trying to prevent that from happening, there will be fear and shame and tension that we bring into our relationship with them, especially over these big, scary topics. So we just kind of continually as parents need to embrace that grief a little bit, that the older our kids get, the more and more brokenness they're going to experience, the more and more pain, the more and more fallenness that they will experience and feel. And we need to just get really adept at grieving that now.
That does not sound very exciting as a
Yeah.
parent.
Sorry.
No, but I think it's actually really interesting that you put it that way because I can see how even me as a parent, right now I have a almost 8-year-old, 5-year-old, and a almost 2.5-year-old, and my whole goal right now is keeping them safe.
Right.
And you're just kind of being the bumper between life,
Yeah.
or between parking lots or, conversations, you're
Or
kind
their
of playing
own
like,
energy. Yeah.
yeah, you're like playing safety um police, if you will. And I think what you're sharing is really interesting where it's like, well, of course they're in a fallen world, but oh wow, they're going to be experiencing more and more brokenness. And the more I react, the more shame will be brought into that part of the conversation. And so it's almost as though you have to like expect the hard conversations all the time
You got it.
without like projecting on them. Like, do not, I'll use an example, right? Where it's like, okay, we want to teach healthy boundaries with our bodies. We shouldn't be going into bathroom stalls with other people.
Mhm.
So it's like without being like, here's everything terrible that could happen if you go into a bathroom stall with somebody, where it's just like, hey, this is a good body boundary. We don't let other people into the bathroom stall with us. And I think that is so interesting. I've never kind of put those two and two together where it's even posing the curious question where it's like, oh, did you notice that, Sarah has two moms?
Mhm.
Or, oh, Madeline has a dinosaur um, lunchbox. It's similar to yours. Isn't that interesting? And like leading them into the questions, like, is that how you do it? Or would it be like, well, Madeline might choose to have dinosaurs because she identifies as non-binary. Like, how do you how do you
Uh,
have this conversation at a
okay.
kindergarten age?
So, first, I will say most parents ask me these kinds of questions exactly the way you are. They're wanting to know the what. What do they do? What do they say? And how do they say it? And I think that
Yeah.
that's really important. And I do think that the answer to that is often very specific to your child within your home with their unique characteristics in your own culture, right? What your kids are seeing in California is very different than what my kids are seeing in North Carolina, right? So, like, even that is a
Right.
consideration we have to take. So I think the what is worth our thought. Bless you. But I
Thank you.
also think that it's not as important as the how, right?
Ah.
How we go about this. So that's what I always like to address first, middle, and last is how. How we go about this is way more important than the what. We'll talk about the what, I promise. But the how is embracing that messy tension, that messy middle of I am tasked with stewarding and protecting my child, kind of like what you said, as the bumper. I'm the bumper between them and Satan right now, the bumper between
Yeah.
them and fallenness. That is part of our role, while also embracing the sad truth that we are not a perfect protection for them. We don't have the power to perfectly protect them. They will be influenced by fallenness, they will be hurt by brokenness. And so when we can hold both of those truths at once, we can stand in that messy middle tension a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to do the best I can without tying my measure of success to the outcome of what my child is or is not exposed to. Because when we do that, that's when shame and fear pops up. We
Mm.
have to tie our measure of success to our stewardship, to our heart before God, right? I'm doing it wholeheartedly. I'm doing it alongside God. That is what will make me successful in this, not that my child didn't get exposed to X, Y, or Z, right? So we have
Yeah.
to embrace the how of that before we can get to the what. I just wanna pause there. Any thoughts on the how?
No, that makes sense. And so in a practical sense, it's like, okay, God, I am wrestling with like that my child might be exposed to this doesn't scare me as much. Obviously, I'm on a podcast talking about this topic, so I'm not as scared. But there are other things that scare me, right? So
Sure.
I think there's the heart posture of like, okay, God, I am wrestling with the idea that my child may come across somebody who's transitioning and I want to respond to them with love when they start asking me questions about this. So that looks like um, help me to have a heart of like, wow, I feel for that child, for that family, pray for their decision making, pray for how they're processing this. Also pray for my child that they can feel loved, that they can know your truth, that they can know that like it is a safe place to talk to mommy and daddy about this. They can always bring their questions to us. So that's my prayer now,
Mhm.
so that when my
I love
child
that.
comes to me and says, "Hey, mom, did you notice that Sarah has two moms?" The response is, "Wow, isn't that interesting? Like, what do you think about that?" Okay, get their thoughts. Well, God calls us to love everybody, and Sarah's family lives differently than us as Christians. I don't think I need to give a 3-point sermon, but just like, wow, isn't that interesting that God made us all different?
Yeah. I love that. You don't have to give 3-point sermon. Probably so often our children are like, "I got a 3-point sermon for my mom when I asked her this question."
100%.
But
100%. My
I
no,
think
it's so funny, and even the difference in the kids, my daughter would be like, "Can we have 10 points? Let's just keep talking through all of this."
she's like, "And one more, another sub point there,
Literally
please."
one sweet question. Okay, sorry, sidebar really fast on this topic. You always think about you have an oldest daughter and you're like, "Wow, when will she talk to me about, like, boyfriends?" Right?
Mhm.
Shout out. I kissed a boy in preschool, so my mom's like, "Apple doesn't fall far from the tree," and I'm like,
Oh, no.
"Preschool? Really? That's crazy." Um, but we sit down, we're reading a book together, and the book is this wholesome, lovely coming of age book about this little girl's aunt getting married, and she's the flower girl. My daughter was like, "Mom, I hope I can find a husband one day." And I was like, "Oh, tell me more about that, sweetie." "Well, I hope he's weird like me." "Okay. I want him to love God." Like, starts running through all
Oh,
these
oh,
things
wow.
that
She
she
knows what she
wants.
wants.
She sure does. 20
She's already
minutes
making the
later
list.
20
Whoa.
minutes later, and my husband's walking around in the background just listen I know he's just listening. And I'm like, "God, please help me not to shame her or to be like,
Mm,
wow, interesting,' or like, why are you thinking about this already?" But it was you never know what's going to spark the conversation. And it's like,
mm,
I think in the moment, like, I wanted to hear where her heart was. I think also to just like gauge, like, okay, is this just like, oh, I love seeing mommy and daddy together, so I desire that? Or was
mm.
this deeper? Was there like, I was trying to figure that out, but as I'm asking these questions, I'm literally dying inside because I'm like, "How am I having this conversation with my 7-year-old?" Like, you have your whole life planned out,
Right.
which again, if you know me, the apple doesn't fall
How
far
did
from
you
the tree.
respond? I'm curious.
Well, I was like, "Honey, it's really great to, like, have dreams and desires, but also building relationships are really, like, they're really complex, and I think right now, like, we can dream and we can hope, and I love that you want somebody that desires these same things that are important to us and our family, but, like, we also just have to focus on, like, learning to be a good friend and learning to, like, care
Mhm.
about people the way that God cares about them," um and then I was waiting for her to just, like, stop asking questions, and that's where the 10-point sermon comes from. She just kept going, and I was like, "Okay, this has to be your last question. We can revisit this another time." But it's interesting because it
That's so
hasn't come
funny.
up again, and so I that was even like a pin and like, oh, she felt very safe in that moment to ask the questions, but, like, again, like, when do you bring it back up? Where it's like, "Hey, remember that one time you were sharing with me about your husband?" I don't want her to think about her husband right now. I want her to think about being in 2nd grade, you know? Um, so anyways, that's the tangent, but I do
No,
feel
I
like
wanna talk about the tangent because I
it's
think that's so important, and I think it really highlights what even our young children are searching for, right? I think her asking you that, I don't know, I wasn't there, like, I wasn't there to ask her and to clarify, but it sounds to me, just based on my own experience and my experience working with clients, is that her desire to be adored, to be loved, to be chased after, to be wanted, to be unique, right? Like all these human desires that God created for us all to have, they aren't bad
yeah.
desires. When we're young and we don't fully understand ourselves and God and the world around us, a lot of times those desires even when we are grown, manifest in romantic relationship because that's what we see
Mhm.
in movies and Disney and all these,
Oh,
in songs, etc. And in
yeah.
our relationship between our parents, right? We see
Yeah.
those needs being met for our parents, hopefully by their, our other parent. And so we want all of those needs of ours to be met in the same way as well. Of course, our kids don't often see the struggle to get those needs met in relationship through some of the
Yeah.
tension that leads to that intimacy. But if we were in that, if I was in that conversation with your daughter, I would have said something like, wow. And you definitely deserve all of that, right? Like all those things that you're
Yeah.
wanting, you deserve that because you are wonderful and beautiful and unique and worthy of being chased after, et cetera, right? The sad reality is that no human can offer that to you perfectly the way that you deserve it, the way that you need it. And that's
Yeah.
okay. God gave us mummies and daddies and siblings and friends and future romantic partners, future husbands or wives that can help meet some of those needs, that can give us just a taste of how God meets those needs fully. So I think that's a good
Mhm.
way to encourage and validate those underlying desires that our kids have, even very young, but also redirect them away from romantic connection when they're too young to get those, some of those desires and needs met in romantic relationship.
Yeah, that's so good. I really wish you were sitting there in the conversation. Also, again, another PSA. I feel like this podcast is typically Morgan learning a lot from Ellen
I
during
don't think it's true.
our sessions. But no, I think that's really good. And like, even I think this is like what we're talking about is like, how do you prepare to have these conversations? Because
Mhm.
now that I know that we're on the brink of this conversation, like, I definitely want to double down on that as she continues to desire these romantic relationships because to be honest, like it didn't necessarily cross my mind to be like, well, yeah, you can totally be those things. Those things are normal, like to feel those and that God can only meet those fully. In my head, I think I was more so freaking out because I'm like,
Yeah.
what how are we
That's where the
here?
how. That's how the how comes in.
Exactly.
You got to
Exactly.
root yourself in the grief, in the stewardship, in the humility, in the surrender, and
Yeah.
then you can focus on the what.
Which in my head, I'm like, just don't freak out. Don't respond with
Yeah.
fear. But I didn't get
But
past that.
you did a great job because I would say the first step in that is to get curious. And what that does is it draws out more of their story so you get more of the context, but it also gives you a beat to process some of that fear
Yeah.
that you're inevitably going to feel when your kid asks that, right? Or something like
Yeah.
that. So you did absolutely the right thing by saying, what do you mean? Help me understand. Tell me more, right? Like lay out
Yeah.
that carpet for them to explain more, get really curious. But I would
Yeah.
say after you get curious, I would make sure to clarify what do you mean by that? I think I'm
Mm.
sure I wrote this in the book. I'm sure I've said it in the podcast before, but when I was a kid, I came home from I think maybe middle school and said, "Mom, what's a period?" And so she explained menses to me. And then after she explained it, she said, "Where did you hear that?" And I said, "Oh, on a TV show, they said they skipped first period." And so my mom was like, "Oh, well, that means something different." So I would say always clarify first. So get curious, draw out the story, understand the context, then clarify what are they really asking. And then I wrote out this template in the book that I can't perfectly remember, but um, you want to get curious, clarify, and then you want to explain. Let me say first, the preface to this template is to helping our children continually learn about some of the core aspects of God's nature. Things like his unconditional love, his, righteousness and his requesting of us righteousness, obedience, free will. We have the free will to not obey, and sometimes that leads to some natural consequences, but also his grace, right? Like there's some core concepts. I think there's like 9 or 10 that I lay out in the book or maybe 6 or 7. But we want our kids to understand these core concepts of God so that when they encounter some of these messy situations in a fallen world, they have the foundation to understand how God could view it with multiple perspectives at once: unconditional love, righteousness, free will, grace, etc. Right? And so
Yeah.
once our kids have that foundation, then it's not so difficult to explain touchy topics with them, right? So for example, your kid comes home and says, a kid in my class was Sarah yesterday and today she's John. How does that work? What's going on? What we want to do is we want to get curious, draw it out. How's your child feeling about this? What are they really asking you? You want to define any terms that they might be confused on, gay, transgender, etc. And then you want to explain this through an earthly lens, right? Sweetie, sometimes in our world, people do transition to live as a different gender than the gender that they were born. And then you want to explain it through God's lens, incorporating all of those aspects of God's nature. So, something to the effect of, though this is typical in our world right now, God, for those of us that choose to live according to God's way, He asks us to remain in the gender that He created us. And whether we understand why or not, we choose to obey Him because we love Him. But not everyone lives the way that we do. And so God calls us to love people no matter how they live, the way that He would, unconditionally, without reservation, and really respectfully. And so then we can come up with ideas, practical ideas with our kids. Tomorrow, when you go to school and you see John, what are some ways that you can let John know that you still love him, that you still want to be friends with him, that you're not ashamed of him, et cetera, right? So we can help our kids encounter this practically once we explain that foundation through an earthly lens, through God's lens, and then through that empathetic lens.
I mean, we could just send the podcast there. It's incredible. It's incredible. And I think it's even so interesting, right? Like as you lay out the how, the what isn't so scary anymore,
Right.
right? The response of being able to use that framework to respond to them is, oh, I could do that. Like that seems so much more doable. But I feel like the grief, the hard work, everything at the front end is where a lot of the processing happens, where it's like, if I can already grieve that my child is going to come in contact with this and or like at some point possibly end up in a relationship with the same gender. I have 3 kids. I'm not going to rule out that a 1 in 3rd chance that it might happen, where it's like,
Right.
how am I going to respond? If I've already grieved that, then when they come to me, the the what's going to be so much easier. And I
Yes.
don't know if
And
it yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, and with anything, we want to practice it. It sounds silly to practice this before it actually happens because I think most parents are like, I hope it doesn't happen. And so they just kind of push that thought away. And then it does happen and they have that thought that we all do. Don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. And then they end up internally freaking out and, making their way through it as best that they can, which I think
Yeah.
can be great. But I think, like you said, a great way to go about that, better way to go about this is pre-grieve as much as possible every
Yeah.
piece of brokenness that your kid encounters. So you're adept at that. You know how to do that. So even when it happens in a moment, you can step into that space. I think another tool to offer, because you're not right, like even if you practiced this heart, the how, and the what over and over, you will still encounter situations where your kid says something and you're like, don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out, right? Like that's going to happen to us
Yeah.
as parents in a fallen
Yeah.
world. So, a great tool that I like to offer parents is something I like to call a temporal boundary. You essentially say, wow, sweetie, what a great question. And it requires a thoughtful response that I just do not have right now. I need some time to think on it. But you can still, like, even in this immediate response, get really curious, draw out the story. Once you really understand, then you can say, thanks so much for trusting me enough to ask this. I just don't have a good response for you right now because I need some time to think and pray on it. Can I get back to you tomorrow? Or let's talk about this Friday night when you get home from school because this deserves a well thought out response and I want to give that to you. I just need some time to think on it, right? And that buys you a little bit of time to freak out in God's arms,
Sure.
to, engage with that grief and then come up with a plan for what you will say and how you will say it.
Yeah, that's so helpful, and I think it is, we did a podcast, oh gosh, maybe like 4 or 5 podcasts ago on grief, and I actually, um, started a grief journal, if you will, every day, like writing down one thing
Wow.
that, like, I grieved that day, whether that is like, I am imperfect and did not have patience with my kids today, and I'm really grieving the impact that
Mm.
had on them, or and I mean, we've had highs and lows where I'm like, even on the high days, like I can grieve that like, wow, I'm a working mom and I'm not getting the quality time that I thought I would have with my kids or, even that. And I think it just makes grief not so scary. It makes the deep well it
Mm.
like pushes the well a little bit more up to the surface so that it's not like, "Ooh, we gotta dig all the way down to the well to like get out the,
Mhm.
feelings and the emotions. And or when they come out, they're not this like geyser of emotions. It's more like, the grief is bubbling up. And so I'm trying to like pull it out a little bit. And I think it's been really helpful. And I think to your point, I'm sharing that because obviously I've shared a lot of failures in this podcast so far of how I have not necessarily handled this perfectly. However, I think the moral of the story and the reason this came up was if we don't arm ourselves, prepare ourselves for these conversations, especially for kids right now, unless you're choosing, I mean, even if you're choosing to homeschool, which is great, whether it's traditional schooling or homeschooling or a hybrid of both, your child is seeing it and hearing it. I mean, if you turn on any show on Netflix right now, unless you're still watching Mister Rogers,
Mhm.
somebody has 2 parents that are the same gender and or there's
Mhm.
somebody who's non-binary or something, right? They're going to come in contact with it. Um, and I think it's just the parenting age we're in right now. And so
Yep.
I really do. I hope this was helpful for other parents who are like, okay, I might not be coming up against this right now, but I know I will be coming up against it in the future. And it's not as scary as it feels because it does feel scary.
Yep. So to some, I guess what we're saying is how to handle this with your how to handle these big scary topics with your child first. Don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. And if you are freaking out, build in some time to freak out apart from your kid in God's arms. It's totally warranted. And sometimes you're going to need that too. Have a template ready to go. Check out my book if you need one or come up with your own, but have a template ready to go and practice it so that you're not caught unaware when your child brings up any scary topic. And finally, grieve constantly. Just as you might have a gratitude journal, I love that. Keep a grief journal so that you can stay adept at grieving. It's not this big, scary thing to you, but it's a familiar, vest that
Coat.
you can put on. Yeah. And say, I know how to do this. It's not fun, but I know how to do it in God's arms. I know how to grieve, and I'm not scared of stewarding my child in fallenness, which is what we're all called to.
Yep, and one more on top of that, start thinking about the how. Like, how are you processing this before the conversation comes up? And plug that in with whatever the big scary topic is for you, right? Like, for
Yeah.
me, it might be this conversation or this experience that my kids are gonna come in contact with, but it could be anything for you. So, if there's one takeaway outside of everything Ellen just said as well, like, just allow yourself to step into the space so that you can be prepared when your kids, bring up a topic that you weren't prepared for. So we appreciate you joining us today. Hope it was helpful, and we'll see you next time.